The sound was wrong. It was not the familiar groan of old timber settling in the midnight heat, nor the scuttling of a raccoon in the grain bin. It was the furtive creak of a single loose floorboard in the barn, a sound a man like Caleb Thorne, who kept his colt by his bed and his memories buried deeper, could distinguish from a mile away. He rose without a sound, his bare feet finding the cool, packed earth of his cabin floor. The air was still and thick with the scent of dust and sun-baked pine, the relentless silence of the Nevada Territory in high summer. He moved through the darkness of his small homestead like a ghost, the heavy pistol feeling like a natural extension of his hand. Therefore, he slid the barn door open just enough to slip through, the metal groaning softly on its leather hinges. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of hay and horse. Moonlight slanted through the cracks in the walls, striping the darkness with silver. He saw it then, a heap of gray fabric crumpled in the corner of an empty stall. It was a woman. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, and even in the dim light he could see the dark smudges of exhaustion and fear on her face. She was Chinese, her black hair in a disarrayed braid against the dusty floor, and she wore a simple gray prairie dress torn at the hem. He approached cautiously, his shadow falling over her. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were dark and wide, with a fear so profound it seemed to steal the very air from the barn. She tried to scramble backward, a small, wounded animal, but a spasm of pain stopped her. Caleb kept the gun lowered but ready. Strangers were trouble, and a stranger hiding in his barn at midnight was a special kind of trouble he had moved 1,000 miles to avoid. "You're on private land," he said, his voice a low rasp from disuse. The woman pushed herself up on one elbow, her gaze fixed on his face. He expected pleas, or maybe tears. He was prepared for lies. But what came next struck him with the force of a physical blow. Her voice was a dry whisper, but her English was clear, precise, and utterly unexpected. "They told me I would find Mr. Thorne here," she said, each word costing her a visible effort. "They said he was a man who understood debts." Caleb froze. The name, one he hadn't heard spoken with that kind of weight in years, landed like a stone in the quiet barn. Thorne. It was a name from another life, a life of smoke-filled saloons and the cold calculus of survival. It was the name he was running from. He looked down at the woman, this frail intruder who had somehow unearthed a ghost, and the questions piled up inside him like a log jam. Who were they? And what kind of debt did she imagine he understood? But she gave him no time to ask. Her eyes rolled back and she collapsed into the hay, the last of her strength gone. For a long moment Caleb stood there, the gun heavy in his hand, the silence of the night pressing in. Every instinct screamed at him to leave her, to ride away and never look back. This was how it started, a loose thread that, once pulled, could unravel everything he had so carefully, so painfully built. Instead, he holstered the Colt. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he knelt, sliding his arms beneath the unconscious woman. She was lighter than a sack of flour. As he carried her out of the barn and into the moonlight, the question repeated itself, a grim tolling in his mind. Not who she was, but what she was bringing back to his door. He laid her on his own narrow cot, the only soft place in the two-room cabin. He lit a lantern, the yellow light casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Her face was pale, her lips cracked. He fetched water from the barrel, dipping a clean rag and gently wiping the grime from her forehead. He saw the bruises on her arms then, dark marks shaped like fingers. Someone had handled her roughly. He dribbled a little water between her lips, and she swallowed weakly in her sleep. Caleb did not sleep. He sat in his one good chair, the Colt across his lap, and watched the eastern horizon. waiting for the dawn or for the trouble he knew was sure to follow. The woman had spoken of debts, and Caleb Thorne knew that some debts were only ever paid in blood. By morning she was awake. She sat up slowly, her eyes taking in the sparse cabin, the stone hearth, the plank table, the shelves holding a few tins and a bag of flour. Her gaze fell on Caleb, who was watching her from the doorway. Fear flickered in her eyes again, but it was tempered with something else, a quiet assessment. "My name is Lin Jing," she said, her voice stronger now. "Caleb," he replied, and nothing more. He had made a thin gruel from cornmeal, the same meal he ate most mornings. He set a bowl on the table. She nodded her thanks and ate with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed out of place in the rough cabin. When she was finished, she stood and, to his surprise, began to move around the small space. She found his meager supplies, the last of the salt pork, a handful of dried beans, the flour, some wild onions he'd gathered. Her hands, though trembling slightly, moved with a practiced efficiency. Caleb watched, suspicious and intrigued. He expected her to explain herself, to tell him who had sent her and what this business of a debt was about. But she said nothing. She simply worked, stoking the fire, soaking the beans, slicing the pork into thin, precise strips. An hour later, the cabin was filled with an aroma so rich and savory it made his stomach ache with a hunger he hadn't realized he felt. She served him a bowl of stew, thick with beans and pork and flavored with the wild onions in a way he couldn't have imagined. It was the best thing he had tasted in a decade. She was an excellent cook. It was a simple fact, but it was also a complication. It made her real, a person with a skill, not just a harbinger of trouble. It made it harder to simply turn her out. They were washing the bowls in silence when the sound of approaching horses broke the midday calm. Caleb's hand went to his pistol instinctively. He moved to the window, peering out from behind the worn burlap curtain. 3 riders. The man in the front was large, dressed in a fine coat despite the heat. Bartholomew Shaw. The man who owned the mining camp to the east, the freight company, and nearly every official in the nearby town of Dry Creek. Shaw was trying to buy up all the homestead claims in the valley, his or anyone else's, using threats and the slow choke of his control over the water rights. Caleb knew him by reputation, a man whose smile was more dangerous than most men's fists. Lin Jing saw the look on his face and went still, the wet bowl clutched in her hands. "Stay inside," Caleb ordered, his voice low, "and stay quiet." He stepped out onto the porch, letting the screen door slap shut behind him. He stood with his arms crossed, a deliberate posture of nonchalance that he did not feel. Shaw reined in his horse a few yards from the porch. His 2 men, rough-looking characters with rifles resting across their saddles, stayed behind him. "Thorne," Shaw said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "Just checking on my neighbors, making sure the heat isn't getting anyone." "I'm fine," Caleb said. Shaw's eyes scanned the small homestead, lingering on the water barrel, the neatly swept porch, the closed door. "Things look tidy," he observed. "You keepin' busy?" His gaze flickered to the ground, where a second set of smaller footprints was clearly visible in the dust near the cabin steps. "Looks like you've had company." Caleb's jaw tightened. "A passing preacher. He shared my meal and went on his way." Shaw smiled, a slow, predatory stretching of his lips. "A preacher? That's not the story I heard. I'm looking for some property that went missing from my camp 2 nights ago. A Chinese girl, small thing, stole some items of value." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping. "I have a tracker, Thorne. He followed her trail right to the edge of your claim. Now, harboring a fugitive, a thief, That can cause a man all sorts of legal trouble, especially a man with a homestead claim still waiting for final approval from the territorial office. The threat was clear. Shaw could ruin him with a word. Caleb's mind raced. He could deny it, bluff his way through. Shaw had no proof. But before he could speak, the cabin door opened. Lin Jing stepped out onto the porch. She had wiped her hands on an apron she'd fashioned from a spare flour sack. She stood straight, her small frame looking impossibly fragile next to Caleb, but her chin was high. She did not look at Caleb. She looked directly at Bartholomew Shaw. "I am no one's property, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the dry yard. "I came here seeking honest work." The directness of her address, the perfect unaccented English, the sheer nerve of it, stunned all three men into silence. Shaw's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise, which quickly hardened into something cold and ugly. He had expected a cowering, terrified runaway. He had not expected this quiet, defiant woman who met his gaze without flinching. He stared at her for a long moment, then his eyes shifted to Caleb, a new, more dangerous understanding dawning in them. He had misjudged the situation. This was more than a simple homesteader hiding a runaway. "Is that so?" Shaw said softly. He gathered his reins. "We'll see what the sheriff has to say about honest work." He gave Caleb one last, hard look. "You've made a poor choice, Thorne." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following close behind. The dust they kicked up hung in the hot, still air long after they were gone. The immediate crisis had passed, but a much larger one had just begun. Caleb turned to Lin Jing, his face a grim mask. The quiet life he'd sought was already shattered. He had been drawn into a conflict he wanted no part of, all because of the woman standing beside him. "You'd better have a good reason for this," he said, his voice tight with a cold anger. "What exactly did you steal from a man like Shaw?" Lin Jing finally looked at him, and the defiance in her eyes was replaced by a deep and profound sorrow. She held his gaze and answered in a voice that was barely a whisper. "His ledger." That night, the oppressive summer heat gave way to a cool breeze that rustled the dry leaves of the cottonwood by the creek. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was not the comfortable silence of two people working, but the tense, waiting silence before a storm. Caleb lit the lantern, and its gentle glow pushed back the shadows. He sat at the table, his hands resting on the worn wood. Lin Jing sat opposite him, the small leather-bound book on the table between them. "My father worked for Mr. Shaw," she began, her voice low and steady. "He was a scribe, a clerk. He kept the books for the Chinese laborers at the silver mine. My father was an educated man. He believed in numbers because numbers, he said, do not lie." Caleb listened without interrupting. He watched her hands folded neatly on the table. They were small, but looked capable, the knuckles slightly red from her work that day. "The men were paid in company scrip, not cash," she continued. "Valid only at Mr. Shaw's store, where the prices were double what they should be. But the books my father sent to Mr. Shaw's partners back in San Francisco, they showed payments in gold coin. For years, Shaw has been stealing from his partners and his workers both. He grew rich, and the men grew poorer, trapped in debt to the very man who was robbing them." Her voice faltered for a moment, and she took a quiet breath. "My father discovered the fraud. He was a careful man. He made his own copy of the real numbers. This ledger." She gently pushed the book across the table toward Caleb. "He was going to send it to the U.S. Marshal in Carson City, but Shaw found out." She looked up, and Caleb saw the raw grief in her eyes. "There was a cave-in at the mine a month ago. They said it was an accident. They said my father was careless. But he was never careless. Shaw had him killed. Caleb opened the ledger. The pages were filled with columns of neat, precise characters, a mix of Chinese and English, alongside rows of numbers that told a clear story of theft on a massive scale. It was damning evidence. "Before he died," Lin Jing said softly, "my father told me about you. It was from a long time ago, maybe 10 years. You were passing through a mining camp in the Sierras. The foreman was beating a young worker, and no one would interfere. But you did. You were just a stranger, but you stopped him. You didn't use your gun. You just stood there. You told the foreman to pick on someone who could fight back. My father never forgot. He said there are many loud men who pretend to be strong, but that true strength was quiet. He said if I was ever in real trouble, I should find the man named Thorne. He said you were a man who understood debts, not of money, a debt of character, a debt to do what is right, even when it is hard." The story hit Caleb with the force of a memory he had long tried to bury. He remembered the camp, the dust, the foreman's cruel face. He hadn't thought of it as a heroic act. He had been younger then, angrier, quicker to step into a fight. He had just been tired of watching a bully hurt someone smaller. To think that this small act, a moment of pure, unthinking impulse, had echoed through a decade to land here, on his table, in the form of this woman and her deadly secret, was staggering. The debt wasn't something he owed her. It was something her father believed Caleb owed to himself. He closed the ledger. "Shaw won't let this go. He'll come back with the law on his side." "I know," she said simply. As if summoned by his words, the sound of a wagon and several horses echoed from the road. Caleb blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness. He moved to the window. In the bright moonlight he could see the town sheriff, a portly man named Gable, climbing down from a wagon. He was holding a piece of paper. With him were 4 other men, all armed, their faces grim. Shaw was not with them, which was somehow more menacing. He was letting his legal dog do the work. "Caleb Thorne!" Sheriff Gable's voice boomed across the yard. "I have a warrant for the arrest of a fugitive from the Shaw Mining Company, believed to be on these premises. The charge is theft. Send her out now, and there won't be any trouble." Caleb looked at Lin Jing. Her face was a pale oval in the darkness, her eyes fixed on him. This was the moment of decision. He could hand her over. He could give Gable the ledger, though the sheriff would surely destroy it. He could wash his hands of the whole affair and perhaps salvage the quiet life he craved. The peace he had worked so hard for was just on the other side of that door. All he had to do was open it and let her walk out. But he thought of her father, a man he'd never met, who had died believing in the character of a stranger. He thought of Lin Jing standing on the porch, facing down a man like Shaw, not with a weapon, but with the simple, powerful truth of her own dignity. The quiet he had found here on this homestead was the quiet of isolation, the peace of a man hiding from the world. It was a hollow thing. He took a deep breath. The choice was not a choice at all. He moved to the door, not to open it, but to stand before it. He didn't draw his pistol, but his hand rested on the worn grip, a silent promise. He pitched his voice to carry across the yard, his words calm and clear and final. "There's no fugitive here, Sheriff," he called out. "Just a lady under my protection. You're not taking her." A tense silence fell over the moonlit yard. Sheriff Gable's face hardened. He had not expected defiance. Caleb had just given up his peace, his anonymity, and his future for a woman he'd known for 2 days. He had just declared war on Bartholomew Shaw. 4 months later, the relentless heat of summer had broken. replaced by the crisp, golden light of autumn. A steady plume of smoke now rose from the cabin's stone chimney, a welcome sight against the deep blue of the Nevada sky. The change on Caleb's homestead was more than just seasonal. A sturdy chicken coop stood where there had once been only packed earth, and the cheerful clucking of hens filled the morning air. Beside the cabin, a small, tilled garden, now mostly harvested, showed the remnants of squash vines and tomato plants. The place felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. The war had been quiet but decisive. The day after the standoff, Caleb had entrusted the ledger to a freighter he knew to be an honest man, along with a carefully written letter to the U.S. Marshal's office in Carson City. For weeks, an uneasy truce had settled over the valley. Shaw's men watched the homestead from a distance, and Caleb and Lin Jing worked under a constant, unspoken threat. But Shaw, wary of a man with Thorne's old reputation, had hesitated to force the issue, choosing to wait for the law to grind in his favor. It was a fatal miscalculation. When the marshal arrived, he did not come alone. He came with federal authority that superseded a bought and paid for town sheriff. Shaw's empire, built on falsified books and intimidation, crumbled under the weight of his own meticulous records. The ledger was undeniable. The investigation it sparked uncovered not just fraud, but extortion, and ultimately the conspiracy that led to the murder of Lin Jing's father. Bartholomew Shaw and Sheriff Gable were now awaiting trial in a federal jail, their power in Dry Creek utterly broken. The town itself was changing. With Shaw's stranglehold gone, people spoke more freely. The miners were being paid in real currency, and families were starting to put down roots. It was becoming a community. Caleb was replacing a post in the corral fence when Lin Jing came out of the cabin, carrying a tin cup of coffee. She handed it to him without a word, a simple daily ritual that had formed between them. He took it, his callous fingers brushing against hers. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the quiet way she moved through the space they now shared. Her cooking had transformed his meager existence, but it was her calm, resilient spirit that had truly changed the homestead. She had brought life back to the dusty patch of land, and to him. He watched as she scattered feed for the chickens, her movements efficient and graceful. The gray prairie dress she had arrived in, tattered and stained, had been washed and meticulously mended. It was a reminder of how she had come to him, a desperate fugitive collapsing in his barn. He thought of her first words, about a man who understood debts. He had believed she was talking about him, about some past deed. He realized now that her father had been speaking of a universal debt, the one all decent people owe to each other. He had spent years trying to bury the man he once was, believing that peace could only be found by erasing his past. But Lin Jing had shown him that his past was not just a collection of violent memories. It also contained a moment of quiet strength, a moment her father had witnessed and trusted. He hadn't outrun his past. He had, with her help, finally turned to face it and found that the best parts of it were still worth saving. The peace he felt now was not the empty silence of being alone. It was the deep, resonant quiet of a shared life, of purpose found not in solitude, but in standing for someone. He looked at his home, at the woman who had made it so, and understood. A man didn't find peace by hiding from the world. He built it, post by post, meal by meal, day by day, with someone by his side. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself and thanks again for being here.